Hello, welcome to our COGIT podcast series. My name is Anthony Richards and I'm the editorial director of COGIT. The intention of this podcast series is to discuss particular themes and issues within terrorism and counterterrorism, and indeed some pressing issues within terrorism and counterterrorism studies. And today's theme revolves around psychological dimensions of terrorism. Now, I'm delighted to be joined today by Professor Max Taylor. Professor Max Taylor is a forensic and legal psychologist with an extensive research track record in terrorism studies. He was one of the first researchers to investigate psychological factors in terrorist behavior and is the author of The Terrorist, Terrorist Lives, and The Fanatics. He's a former director of the Center for the Study of Terrorism and Political Violence at the University of St Andrews, and is currently the co-editor of the leading terrorism journal, Terrorism and Political Violence. Max, it's a real pleasure to have you with us. Thanks very much for coming along.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
I suppose my first question relates to the contribution that you kindly made to our edited volume called Jihadist Terror. And in it, you noted that the literature is replete with the failure to construct terrorist profiles, whether that be on personality traits, psychopathology, religious orientation, or racial and or economic background. So I guess my question is that in your view, why has any such attempt to generate such profiles been seen as such a forlorn quest?
I don't know that it's a forlorn quest, but and there are a number of reasons why there are difficulties around it. But perhaps one of the fundamental ones is knowing what it is that you're doing a profile for. If you are, for example, you have to assess an individual who's being convicted, let's say, of an offence, and you need to construct some kind of sense of prediction about is he going to be violent or she's going to be violent or that kind of thing, then constructing what I think you might refer to as a profile can be quite reasonable. It's quite sensible and reasonably good predictive value. If you find yourself at a crime scene, for example, where an offence has occurred, and you have in front of you an array of the things that have happened, the body or the bomb or whatever it is, the things that are around. Again, there are things that you can do to supplement good detective work from a psychological perspective to sort of progress the investigation onwards. What you can't do, it seems to me, notwithstanding the sort of early FBI claims in this, is to construct from that kind of crime scene data a sort of complex summary or identification of an individual. Somebody's got black hair and a broken arm, and so that sort of at that level of detail to identify somebody. I don't know that there's much evidence about that being very successful at all. Certainly no more than a trained detective would be, for example, in managing a crime scene and moving things forward. Where you really get into difficulties, it seems to me, is when you don't have an offender in front of you who's committed an offence, so you know something about what they've done, or where you've got a crime scene in front of you where you may not know who's done it, but here is something that's happened. And you want to say about somebody in advance of something happening, this man is dangerous or not dangerous. That's much more difficult to do. And one of the problems about it is that an awful lot of, I suppose, guess what you call profiling is premised on the idea that you can look for generalities between people. So some categories of offender have these kinds of qualities, for example. There are very, very few terrorist offenders. So you don't have that group of people that you can draw on. You can't say, oh, well, this is what they're all like. This man will be like that. It doesn't work that way at all. So the narrowness of your client base, as it were, is one problem. The second problem is that we're not at all clear what we mean by a terrorist offence. There are lots of different things that we label terrorist. that don't necessarily have any kind of psychological reality. Um, if you look at the current situation with Israel and Palestine, are the Palestinians terrorists by launching rockets into Israel? Well, very possibly, perhaps that's what you'd want to say. Is that the same as an ex-IRA bomber who went and blew up somebody in Belfast? No, it's not. It's a very different kind of thing that's happening, and the individuals are doing very different kinds of things. So to progress your thinking, you need, first of all, to be much clearer about um, the purpose of what you want to do, to be very clear what it is that you want to achieve from profiling. And then secondly, you need to be really clear about what exactly is it that you're worried about. Are you worried about dangerousness? Well, that's a quite complex idea. What does that mean? Are you worried about someone doing a specific kind of act? So there's a whole array of really complicated things that you need to be clear about before you embark on answering questions about how adequate or inadequate or whatever these things are. I don't know that. I think another part of the problem as well is that expectations have been raised by media and TV representations of psychological profiling. The film Minority Report, everybody's heard about that. There you've got this idea that somehow or other you can predict in advance something that's going to happen if you've got special knowledge. Well, maybe that's true, but we don't have that special knowledge. We can't do that. TV programs like Forensics and so on seem to suggest that it's actually all laid out there and you can work it out. Well, it's not. It's much more complicated than that. I've worked in situations where I think psychological advice has progressed investigations, and I think the people involved would agree with that. But the idea that that alone will generate the identification of an offender is just not realistic.
Right.
So we need to be clear what it is that we want. What do you want to do? What exactly is it that you're worrying about? What kind of an individual do you think you're dealing with? And then, be realistic and ground yourself in a reality. Once you can do that, then I think there is value. And I think this is not just about profiling, but it's about contribution that psychology can make to these things. There's then lots of things that you can do, but you need to be clear. And quite a lot of the time, we're not clear and we have unrealistic expectations.
Thank you, Max. Yes. In your book, related to this, suggested it might be valuable to try and assess potential psychological patterns of
Right.
terrorist engagement. And I wonder if you could perhaps elaborate a little further on that. In other words, what are these patterns perhaps, and how might they be of value in helping us to understand trajectories towards terrorism?
Well, again, I'll try and answer your question in a sort of roundabout way, I think. One of the ways that we try to understand offending behavior generally and terrorism in particular is we look at them and say, what characteristics do these people have? And when you do that, you find invariably that they fit into some kinds of categories. They sort of have social economic deprivation. Uh, People talk about, I don't know, disturbed childhood, whatever it is. These the whole array of things that we associate with malfunctioning behaviours of one kind or another. But these things are never predictive. They don't. You can't just say, well, somebody who's got this, this, and this will then become a terrorist, because the world is full of people who've got that array of things. How do you know that this individual is going to be the one that will commit an offence as distinct from 30 or 40 other people who had similar kinds of experiences but won't do anything? Um, that's, if you like, the great challenge in all of this, isn't it? It's an obvious point to make. Um, I think that we need to be a bit more systematic in the way that we think about offending, and then be very clear that where the boundaries are about what we can and can't do. I think a useful way of looking at understanding offending is to make a distinction between factors that relate to being involved in a milieu that might be associated with an offending activity like terrorism. In other words, to identify things that might make an individual, you could call them a motivated offender, and those factors that relate to the actual event of pulling a trigger, placing a bomb, doing whatever it is that the issue is. And if you do that, there's then a very quite critical insight, which is that the things that you might do to stop somebody from engaging with a terrorist milieu are rather different from the kind of things that you might do if you stop somebody from trying to plant a bomb. And they're not the same kinds of things, and they're not going to do this. You're not going to approach them in the same kind of way. Um, I think if you start to look at the notion of milieu, then there are threads that you can discern that are reasonably common. One thing that seems to be um, a common enough thing to say will be social disadvantage. Now, as it happens, most terrorists, it seems to me, certainly the ones I've ever met, don't come from socially disadvantaged backgrounds at all, but they claim to represent social disadvantage very often. So social disadvantage is a factor in the story, but it's not the story. Um, Addressing that points to some kind of a long-term intervention that will attempt to deal with societal issues. Stopping an offence relates to the things that you might do in the here and now, target hardening, moving things around, making things accessible, more accessible. That seems to me to be the way to think about um, patterns of behaviour. It's not to identify a checklist that you pick off and say this is this and this identifies a potential offender. It's about looking at the thread of things that contribute to the aggregation of events. The difficulty is, and I don't know the solution to this, and I've spent 50 years trying to think about it as well, I suspect. Um, you've got a whole array of things that are necessary for an offence to occur sometimes, but none of them are sufficient to explain the offence. So when you look at each individual offender, you'll find that they have bits in common with other people, but they have lots of things that are not in common with other people. So you really, and because you're dealing with a very low incidence crime as well, you really are being forced to think about this at an individual level. So you can look at predispositions, you look at propensities, you can look at patterns, I guess, and they will all help you to form a sense of alertness, as it were. But what you can't do, in my experience anyway, is move beyond that to say, oh, well, this man is going to offend, or this or that will happen. It just doesn't work like that at all. I think the another way of approaching the same kind of issue relates to the idea of affordances. I've written about this. We published a collected volume some years ago on terrorism and affordances. Um, Affordances are the properties of things that make a behavior more likely to happen, but they don't cause it. So I've just written a piece actually on Trump and the 6th of January, trying to use, amongst other things, the idea of affordances there. Trump made lots of speeches that wired people up, as it were, but only one speech resulted in violence, and in Washington on the 6th of January. And I take it one of the reasons for that is that the affordances of being in Washington, the presence of the Capitol, all the other things that were around it, made made violence more likely to happen. They didn't cause it, but they made it more likely to happen. And I think that's a useful way of thinking about this notion of patterning of behavior. That things in the environment change the probability of responding. That's a kind of technical way of putting it. And whilst they don't cause behavior, they make some behaviors more likely to happen than others. That, of course, isn't a huge help for the counter-terrorism official who's got to stop something happening, because it doesn't enable him to say, all right, pull this button or do this or whatever, and intervene at this point. But it's a way of thinking about it. And then I think that goes on with the other thing which I've learned over my time in this area is to value the experience of experienced officers who are very good at this, who know when things aren't right, who can read the environment. I remember learning about this in Northern Ireland years and years ago. I don't. I think sometimes we don't value the experience of the policemen or the security service people who are totally immersed in this and understand it. And it's part of that understanding, I think, is the sensitivity to the affordances that are there in the environment.
Yeah, fantastic. Thanks very much, Max. Yes, your edited volume was in 2012, I think, on affordances. It's very
Yeah,
interesting
a
indeed.
while ago. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, they're very relevant and interesting. Well, actually, referring to a further edited volume that you produced, which is in 2016, and it was on evolutionary psychology.
Aye.
I wonder if you could perhaps sort of briefly outline what you mean by evolutionary psychology, and how might it help us to understand the motivations and reasons for terrorism, perhaps?
The honest answer to that is I don't know. The book was speculative in the sense that uh, you must feel this. I'm sure the audience sometimes feel this. Your bones, you know something's interesting, but you don't always know quite why. Evolutionary psychology talks about behavior adjusting to the environment, but it also talks about behaviors, as it were, being partially built into you. You're more likely to do some things than others, and that's one way of thinking about an evolutionary context of behavior. Violence is built in. We are violent, and there are. I I suppose I hesitate to say this. I suspect all of us, in the right circumstances, will be violent if given the right setting. So, and it's something that's built into us. Emotionals, the sense of the feelings of emotions and so on, they're built into us. We can learn to control them. That's what it's called being civilized, growing up, or development, or whatever. But there are sort of fundamental qualities to living that are there, and what comes with that, I think, are notions like affordance. I mean, the idea of affordance fits very much into this sort of evolutionary notion. The notion that the environment shapes us and that we shape the environment. And therefore, when we look at any given piece of behavior, we're actually looking at the product of a very complex process. And that's the sense in which I would put the ideas about evolution. So it's not about survival of the fittest or that sort of simple-minded stuff at all. It's about thinking of the generation of behavior as being a complex process. Um, and some of the qualities to that process are built into us. A large number of them we learn. Some of them are physical because they relate to the kind of environment where we are. Some things are possible, some things aren't. But they're also social, because we live in a constructed social world as well. So we're looking at in any given piece of behavior, we're looking at a really very complex array of forces. And trying to understand those forces is challenging. And whether this is helpful or not, I don't know. I found it helpful, though, to think about terrorism as in that way. As I said, I've just done a bit on Trump's 6th of January speech. One element of that is, and this probably sounds a bit disconnected, the American idea of national identity. Now, that's not is that a psychological concept? Well, I suppose in a sense it is, because we all have an individual sense of identity, but what does a sense of national identity mean? That's a very complicated idea. Huntington, though, wrote a paper in around the time when I can't remember the date of the paper now, around the time when Russia was imploding, where he talked about deficiencies and difficulties in the American sense of national identity, that the American idea of being an American was changing. and that there was a vacuum. And you might argue that Trump's ideas filled that vacuum and moved into it. Maybe popularism does that. Now, that's one kind of force that shapes behavior. It's not a very tangible one, but it's very real. We know what a sense of national identity means, although it might be difficult to actually tie it down. I take it notions about Brexit and so on are embedded in that, aren't they? Or draw on it. I brought this in simply to say that when you look at any piece of behavior, you're looking at a really complex set of relationships between things, between history, between physical environment where you are, between you as where you've come from. And I think understanding takes us down all of these avenues all at the same time. And you just try and emphasize one or other that you feel you can understand. For me, that's been psychology. It could equally have been social structures, it could have been political science, because they all of them, when we look at terrorism, all of these things are just absolutely relevant. We need to think about them all. Does
Absolutely,
that
yeah.
make sense to you? I'm
Yeah,
not
yeah,
sure.
absolutely.
I'm
It
not
does.
sure it's come over very clearly.
It does, Mike. Thank you very much indeed. I mean, there's another concept, perhaps, I bring up here, and I remember you discussing this at the University of St Andrews when we were both up there, and that is this concept of communities of practice.
Aye.
I'm wondering, if you can elaborate what you mean by community of practice and how can it be applied to understanding behavior, how terrorists might learn from experience, how they might acquire knowledge, that sort of thing.
That's exactly it. I mean, I mean, the example given of a community of practice is apprenticeship training, training on the job, as it were. You less so these days, but certainly in the past. When you signed up to be an apprentice for whatever it was, 5 years, you didn't necessarily go and take courses in how to do plumbing or doing whatever. You worked with a plumber and you learnt what he did and you observed what he did and you absorbed the values of plumbing or whatever it was that you were looking at. You absorbed the skills of it. You became part of a separate group, a group that had sort of specialist knowledge, almost a kind of medieval notion of a guild. It's a little bit like that, isn't it? You became separate. Now it's not separateness isn't something to emphasize perhaps, but it's distinctiveness. You have a skill and you've learned that skill because you've worked with somebody who's got that skill. In I still think that when we talk about development into terrorism, that's one of the kinds of forces, if you like, that enables people to move from being a bystander to something else. And the internet has changed that. I mean, I think what really is relevant there is that the idea of you don't sit next to somebody now because somebody might be thousands of miles away, but in a sense you are next to somebody because the internet enables you to be very close to somebody. Now, you're not necessarily learning a physical skill there. You might be learning, if you like, a psychological orientation or a way of a perspective, a way of viewing things. But it seems to me that the internet enables the emergence very easily of communities of practice that enable people to learn. And I think one of the authors who doesn't, I think, get sufficient attention in the terrorism world that's talked about this is Karen Norsetina, who talks about distributed learning and essentially distributed communities of practice. That seems to me to be something that's different now from 20, 30 years ago when I began to work in these kind of areas. We've got the internet. And I think that's one of the factors, it's not the only factor, because the emergence of someone into an engagement with terrorism, what we these days we call radicalization, but we didn't used to. That's a quite complex process, but I think notions about communities of practice are one element in that story. I think there were three threads which seemed to me that were very all interrelated. They, in a sense, do come together under the idea of evolutionary psychology: the idea of affordance, the idea of communities of practice, and the notion of a role of ideology. religion as ideology, and of rule governance, because that's how I would think about ideology. And those things seem to me to be really, not the only foundations, but important foundations for understanding terrorist behavior.
Excellent. Thank you very much. That's really well summarized at the end there. I wonder if you could, this is a very general question to finish off, Max. How would you summarize what the practical implications of your many years of research into terrorism, how would you summarize the practical implications for counter-terrorism? Are there things that work and things that don't work in experience, in your experience from your research? And is there anything in particular that the government should be doing that they're not doing? What's your take on that?
One of the things that one of the virtues or deficits, I don't know how you express this, of being very old and having been around for a long time, is that you see things coming and going. You see people selling ideas that are rubbish, but they meet the needs of the moment. Everybody buys into them, and then a few years later they've gone. But it doesn't matter, because that individual's gone too, and they've made the money out of it. You become quite cynical about thinking about contribution that things can make and so on. The one enduring contribution I think we can bring, that is to say the academic community, is learning, is training, enhanced training, better training, enabling people to reflect on what they already know. I when we were in St Andrews, one of the things I tried to develop, not terribly successfully, I think, but I tried anyway, was this idea of the scientist practitioner. The idea that you had the professional who knew about things and who was very good at it, and we don't value professional knowledge, it seems to me, anywhere near enough. You had the professional, and he becomes better by understanding the context in which his activities can be understood. So I think if there's anything I've learned from this, it's not to be a pretend counterterrorism officer, or to be a pretend policeman or whatever, but to be able to work with people to enable them to be better at what they already know. One of the things I learnt from working in Northern Ireland, the time of the hunger strikes, and a long time ago now, you had men there that really did understand terrorism. They were fantastic, and they were often constables. They were often men who would not want to rise because they were also small farmers, or they did other things as well. But they had incredible knowledge, and that knowledge got lost because they retired, because they got old, or whatever it is. And it's always been it's kind of haunted me in a way, that how sad it is that you've got this fantastic body of knowledge that's built up by people doing the job that just gets lost. And we, that is to say the academic community, those of us from outside looking, we benefit from learning what they know, but they can benefit, I think, from thinking about things or understanding how we think about things as well. I have some experience of working with police in investigative activities and the like, and I think what we've done has contributed. It's not been dramatic, but I think everybody's benefited from a sensible engagement at that level of the scientist practitioner. I wanted to try and see that happen in St Andrews. We did to some extent, but not in others. So if you say what do I think the best thing we could do is, well, I think the best thing will be to invest in training, invest in engagement and joint engagement between the research community, I wouldn't just call it the academic community, the research community, and the practitioner community, that will enable open discussion and non-critical examination of good and bad. And if you could achieve that, if you could create a world that would, a setting, an institution that would enable that non-punitive good and bad analysis, I think that will be a fantastic contribution. I really do. And that would then enable all the knowledge that we picked up. And there's a huge amount of knowledge now. I mean, the world is very different from when I started off in this world. We know massively more now. We're not always using it well, we certainly know a great deal more. If you could create an environment where that would happen, I think that would pay off enormously, in my view.
Thank you very much, Max. Well, once again, Max, thank you so much for joining us and sharing your thoughts and expertise and extensive experience with us. Thank you once again.
Thank you.